So the book of Exodus is very much a continuation from the book of Genesis. In fact, Exodus doesn't really make sense without the book of Genesis. And what drives much of the book of Genesis are God's promises to Abraham. So God promises Abraham three things. There's a promise that his descendants will be his people, a people in covenant with him, and a people as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the grains of sand on a seashore. They'll become a great nation. And then there's the promise of land. The land where Abraham resided would one day belong to his descendants, the promised land. And crucially, there is a promise of blessing, that his descendants will be a blessing for all nations. And Abraham goes to his grave knowing that these promises will be fulfilled, but that the path to them will not be easy. So, for instance, Genesis 15, 13 to 15 says that the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I'll punish the nations they serve as slaves, and afterwards they'll come out with great possessions." Of course, Abraham doesn't know exactly how this will happen. Who is this nation that will enslave them? And when do these 400 years begin? And as you read through Genesis, Abraham only has one son of the promise, Isaac, hardly a great nation. And Isaac only has one son of the promise, Jacob. Esau is rejected. But then Jacob does have a large family, including 12 sons. And of course, one of those sons, Joseph, does end up in the country not his own, Egypt. Joseph was subjected to terrible sufferings, the rejection by his brothers, the ill treatment, the selling into slavery, the ill treatment by Potiphar, and his imprisonment. But all those sufferings, in the end, turned out for good. God had meant the terrible experiences that Joseph had to endure for good. His whole family was saved from famine, and Egypt was saved, as were other peoples who came to Egypt for help. God was working out his purposes. And God had assured Jacob that going down to Egypt was part of his plan. So Genesis 46, God spoke to Israel, that's Jacob. "Here I am," says Jacob. "I am the God of your father," he said. "Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation, and I will surely bring you back again." So going down to Egypt is part of God's plan to fulfill his promises to Abraham. And as we turn to Exodus, the first thing we find in verses 1 to 7 is that sure enough, God is fulfilling his promises. First, we get a bit of a recap as we're reminded that all of Jacob's 11 sons went down to Egypt. And if you counted them up with their children and grandchildren, it came to 70 in all. It must be said that that number 70 didn't include Joseph and his sons who were already in Egypt, but the writer wants to get to 70. 70 is significant. It's a complete number, and it tells us that this is a good beginning. But inevitably, Joseph and his brothers all die as time moves on. So what is to become of Jacob's descendants, indeed of the promises to Abraham? Well, look at verse 7. The Israelites, it says, were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. God set about fulfilling some of that promise to Abraham. From the 70 who went down to Egypt, there is this massive population growth. God's promise that from Abraham would come a great nation was coming to fulfillment. The Israelites, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were so numerous that the land was filled with them. From that 70, a good number, but a relatively small number, has now come this huge number. And notice the words that are used to describe this population growth. Exceedingly fruitful, increased in number, the land was filled. And the writer is deliberately choosing the words of God's creation mandate to the first humans back in Genesis chapter 1, and then repeated to Noah. So Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. And the same or similar words to Noah in chapter 9, verse 7, be fruitful, increase in number, multiply on the earth, increase upon it. And we're meant to see that the Israelites are fulfilling God's creation mandate to humanity, to be fruitful. God is thereby fulfilling his promise to make Abraham's descendants a great nation that will become a blessing to all nations. And we can see a principle at work here. God does work out his promises for his people, but he does it in his own time. We live in a world of great uncertainty, and it's commonplace to find people breaking promises. Politicians are quick to accuse opposing parties of broken promises. Waiting lists will come down. Taxes will not go up. Growth will come. And when the pledge is broken, trust is undermined in politics. It's not just politics. We've become accustomed to seeing couples break up. Promises were made, marriage vows, but they just couldn't keep them. And the more people see marriages break up, the more that undermines trust in the point of making such promises in the first place. And we're all capable of promising something, promising we'll do something, but not quite managing it, or just simply finding a reason to break that commitment. And all these broken promises can make us feel suspicious of promises. Can we really trust a promise that somebody makes? Well, the story of God's dealings with his people in Genesis and Exodus teaches us that we can trust God to fulfill his promises. That was true then, and it's true today. And throughout the New Testament, the key promise God gives us, the hope that we have, is that Jesus will return to this earth in glory. Having come to earth to save us, having made that possible through the cross and the resurrection, he's now ascended to the right hand of the Father. But he has promised to return. He will restore all things and bring about that final rescue when we will be taken, as it were, over the Jordan into the promised land, into the new Jerusalem, the new heaven and earth. But we don't know when. The promise to Abraham had a time scale on it, 400 years in Egypt. But we don't have a time scale. We don't know the time or the hour when Christ will return. But we can be certain that the day of the Lord will come. Why can we be so certain? We're certain because he has promised in the past, and we can see that he's fulfilled his promises in the past. And God does not change. He will fulfill his promise in the future. But back to the passage. Look at verses 8 to 14. God is with his people in the darkest times. Remember what God had told Abraham, that his descendants would be enslaved before they came back to the promised land. And it's at this point that this comes to fulfillment. A new king over Egypt arises who knows nothing about Joseph, and he opposes God and his people on two counts. First, he opposes their obedience to God's creation mandate to be fruitful. And secondly, he opposes any idea that God's people should leave Egypt. This man is anti-God, and that becomes more and more apparent as this story unfolds. And basically, he fears these people because they become so numerous. He fears that they'll join with any enemy if war breaks out. And what seems worse, he fears they will leave the land. So on the one hand, he sees them as a threat, but on the other hand, he sees them as a very useful thing for the economy of the country. So Pharaoh needs a plan that minimizes their perceived threat, yet maximizes their usefulness. So, of course, his solution in verse 11 is to effectively enslave the Israelites. Slave masters are appointed to oppress them, to make their lives difficult and burdensome. They're forced to work on building projects. Supply cities are constructed, Pithom and Ramses, and they're forced to work in the field so these supply cities can be filled with food. So for Pharaoh, this plan seems like a win-win. Not only is it designed to suppress their fruitfulness, but it also maximizes their usefulness. But verse 12 tells us, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. The plan spectacularly backfires. The more the Egyptians oppress the Israelites, the more they thrive and spread out. The plan was meant to stop them multiplying, but instead it resulted in them multiplying more. Sure, they get a couple of store cities, the Egyptians, out of it, but everyone would benefit from that, including the Israelites. How this happened isn't made clear, but this has to be God working out his purposes. That fruitful multiplication is a sign of God's creative blessing, God the Creator's blessing. And God may not be mentioned, but his hidden hand is present despite appearances. Being fruitful, bearing children, it is not a given. God seems to have aided the fertility and the safe births. And even though oppressed, God's people remain fruitful. So ultimately, God is behind this, and he'll not be thwarted, whatever the opposition. And this is what he'd revealed to Abraham all those years before. God was fulfilling his promise despite opposition. But in all this, God's people are suffering. Verses 13 and 14 tell us the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. This was hard labour, back-breaking work with the constant threat of severe punishments. No doubt the brick quotas were high, the treatment was harsh and cruel, and we know they were beaten and ill-treated. But we see a principle here. Christians may well go through times of suffering and darkness, but God will continue to multiply his kingdom. That his kingdom will continue to grow. We were thinking a bit about this if you were here last week. Despite opposition and persecution in communist China today, there are more Christians in China than the whole of the UK population. I downloaded the new Chinese chatbot this week, DeepSeek. It was happy to answer lots of questions that I put to it, including giving me a sermon on this chapter, which I've ignored. But when I asked how Christians are treated in China, the system went down for a few seconds and no answer appeared. And when asked about Tiananmen Square, it said that it would prefer to be asked about logic puzzles instead. China is by no means a free society, and it's still difficult to be a Christian in China. But despite the suffering and the darkness, God has continued to spread the gospel and to multiply his people, because God will not be thwarted in multiplying and growing the church of Jesus Christ throughout the world, despite the opposition. There's another more subtle principle to see here. Bitterness must not be allowed to take root. Verse 14 tells us that the oppression the Israelites suffered was so bad that their lives were made bitter. That's something that they were later to remember each year in the Passover by eating bitter herbs. But when they remembered this oppression, it was not meant to stir up bitterness within, but rather consideration and kindness. It's meant to have a positive impact on. And later, as they prepare to enter the promised land, God tells them to remember this ruthless cruelty that they suffered and to make sure that they treat any workers they have very differently, not harshly, but considerately. Just because they were treated badly doesn't mean they should treat others badly. Of course, this is counter to the way things so often work. As people are treated harshly and unfairly, they take it out on others, those weaker than themselves. But we need to guard against this. The godly thing to do is not to use the bad experiences which we have in our lives to cause us to treat others in the same kind of way. We must not try to let, or we must try not to let the bitterness that enters our hearts fester and grow and then break out against others. We need to instead be considerate and kind and slow to anger. That's how God wants to work in us through the power of his Spirit. Which leads us to the last part of this chapter, verses 15 to 21. God thwarts those who oppose him through the faith and courage of his people. Because his plan wasn't working, Pharaoh comes up with a darker, more insidious idea. In order to suppress their fertility, Pharaoh decides to have the baby boys killed when they are born, but to spare the girls. If his plan worked, all that would be left would be girls, and he'd lose his cheap labour source, but maybe he knew this, and maybe he wasn't planning on completely eradicating the boys, but simply suppressing them. But this chilling, cold-hearted and monstrous act, which is devoid of any sense of what is right in the eyes of God, these days we would call it genocide, something we've come to know all too well in the last 100 years or so. The Holocaust, which we sadly remembered this week, where 6 million Jews were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. And then in more recent memory, the killing fields of Cambodia in the 70s, the killing of Bosnian males in the Balkan Wars of the 90s, and the genocide in Rwanda when 1 million were slaughtered. In order to carry out this plan, he tells the Hebrew midwives to kill the boys as soon as they're born. Perhaps he thinks they'll be able to do it surreptitiously, so that no blame could then be attached to them, a kind of Lucy Letby. And certainly if he expected them to openly kill the babies, this chilling behaviour wouldn't last very long, because the mothers would stop calling for the midwives. So we come to verse 17, and the first mention of God in the book of Exodus. In the middle of all this darkness and horror, a beam of light is thrown out. The midwives, however, feared God. To go against the king, the most powerful man in the land, just wasn't what any ordinary person would do. But he doesn't say that they feared Pharaoh. Their fear was of God. And their motivation for resisting Pharaoh was fear of doing something which would go against what God's commands and his will are. And killing babies was the exact opposite of what God would want. They refused to carry out Pharaoh's order. And when Pharaoh asks them why they've let the boys live, their answer is rather clever. They claim that Hebrew mothers give birth much faster than Egyptian mothers, and they had no time to get to the births. Were they mocking Pharaoh, or was this true? We can't be sure. And we're not told that what they told him was false. But what we do know is that they killed no babies and that they did not carry out Pharaoh's order. And as a result, the midwives' actions are rewarded by God with families of their own. Not only that, we're told that the Israelites kept on growing in number. God was thwarting Pharaoh through the faith and courage of these midwives. And did you notice the irony? The names of these midwives are recorded and remembered, but that of Pharaoh is not. The midwives' faith is meant to be an example to us. They act just like Daniel in disobeying the edict of the king of Babylon to worship an idol, which would mean that he got thrown into a den of lions. And they act just like the apostles who were ordered not to preach the gospel, but refused. And in the end, some were persecuted to death for their refusal. And in a godless and anti-God culture, Christians are marked out by their faith, which drives them to courageous obedience. And there's no doubt that so much of the culture in which we live today is opposed to God and to obedience to his ways. And it takes faith and courage to act in obedience, to resist the temptation into sexual immorality, to resist temptation to greed and the love of money, to value human life, to act believing that we are made in the image of God, to seek to love one another, to forgive and not to harbour bitterness and anger, and to stand up for what is right despite the opposition that we may face. So let me sum up what we can take from this passage. Keep trusting God. Firstly, we can trust God to keep his promises, not least that Christ will return one day, and we need to be ready for that return. Secondly, Christians may well go through times of darkness and suffering, but God will continue to multiply his people. Jesus will build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. And lastly and thirdly, in a godless and anti-God age, our trust in God is marked out by our fear of God, which will mean obedience to his commands, in gratitude for his saving love towards us. We love God and we love one another, not allowing bitterness to grow in our hearts.